Hi, everybody. The camera light's not on, but I think I'm on. This is Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm here today with Newton Taxpayers Association Taxpayer Talk. Today's May 15th, 2023, and I'm honored to have with me as a guest Mr. Paul Levy, who's both the outgoing school committeeman and an outgoing gentleman in general. And so I have had him on the show before, I think when he was running, and now he's running away, possibly from the great work he's been doing. We're very much honored to have him here and in his debt. And so unfortunately, this is the way we repay him by having him come on the show. But we're here to talk about things going on in the Newton school system, what you at home, dear listener, viewer, can do about it, what is going on with the school committee and the Newton schools in general. So Paul, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me. Again.
Appreciate that. Would you like to rebut my introduction?
No, not at all.
Okay, smart choice.
I'll wait.
Paul, thank you so much, first of all, for your putting yourself out there and running. It is something that many of us won't do, haven't done. My wife did, and it's a tiring task, and oftentimes a thankless task. So I want to say thank you for doing what you've done. But tell us a little bit about your trials, tribulations, what you've learned, and what it was like running for and then being on the school committee, and then we'll come up with a follow-up.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to say that running was really pleasurable. The campaign was kind of humbling, I'll tell you, because first of all, people were very gracious. They appreciated the fact that I was making the effort and, as you say, putting myself out there to run. And I had an opponent, and we had very different points of view about where the school should be going and how the school committee should operate. So in Newton, although you run from your ward, and I'm in Ward 6, which is in the elementary schools, it's Bowen and Mason Rice, you run citywide, you run at large. And so I was all over the city talking to people at parties and online and going to the village days, and people were so gracious and open about their issues and their concerns about the school system that I learned a lot. I also made a lot of friends along the way, which was nice. I'd lived in the city for 40 years. I figured I knew a lot of people, but I knew a lot more after that. So I would encourage anybody to run because it's a great experience. It's better when you win also, and I happened to win, which was nice. And then came the aspect of the job that you actually run for, which is to be in the position. The school committee in Newton has 9 members, 8 elected from each ward, and the mayor is ex officio. And each of us actually has no authority on our own. The school committee only has authority when it acts as a body, when 5 people vote to do something or other. So it's very different from running, because when you're running, you're on your own and you're making your positions known. But when you're on the body itself, you have to try to be persuasive. It's a great experience. You should try it.
That's a good point. You know, like I said, my wife ran in 2015. She ran for alderhuman, now city councilorhuman. And there was a race, 4 people running for 2 seats. She came in a close third. There was a kind of a lagging fourth. So she did very well. One of the incumbents became an outcumbent. And so there was some progress there, I guess. And so but you know, it was an onerous task.
It takes a lot of time and effort. In essence, it becomes a full-time job while you're running. I was fortunate in that during COVID, a lot of my business activities kind of went away, and so I had the time to do it. And you also have to raise a good amount of money. So for example, to do a mailing, just a postcard mailing across the city, costs anywhere between $10,000 and $12,000 to produce. So if you want to do 3 mailings during the course of a campaign, you need $40,000 more or less in your campaign account. And because there's virtually no media in town in terms of news coverage the way there might have been years ago, the only way to get the word out is by word of mouth and being there in person and doing mailings.
I agree. I don't want to divert to this topic, but there was just the tax override,
Yeah.
and we were somewhat active. I had 5 or 6 shows on the topic, and so, taxpayer. And my wife, was busy doing some of that same kind of stuff, quote unquote, licking envelopes and whatnot.
Yeah. And think about, speaking of taxes and taxpayers, the school budget is roughly 2/3 of the entire City of Newton budget.
Mm-hmm.
It's roughly $250 million. So it's a huge enterprise. There are about 11,000 kids in the schools. There are, I think, 2,000 employees, more or less. Most of the budget itself is salaries of teachers. It's well over 80% of the budget is salaries. And then there are some other expenses as well. There's probably about $30 or $35 million of expenses for utilities, for transportation, and the like. But in essence, you're running a very people-intensive enterprise. And the thing I've found, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is people want to know what they're getting for their money, whether they have children in the schools or whether they're part of the 80% of the population that doesn't have children in the schools, but whose property values are very dependent on the quality of the school system.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's an interesting point. Now, you have experience as an executive in the business world. I'm a medical doctor, and you've worked with your fair share of medical doctors.
Indeed.
And I'm wondering, what are the similarities, what are the differences? What is it like being a CEO, I believe at Beth Israel,
Right.
whatever they call it then, or a Beth Israel deaconess, something, whatever, and it was whatever it is called now. Anyway, versus the school committee, when you're not the CEO.
Great.
What was that like? What was the experience like in the committees? I would run for office if they made me king or something like that. But as far as being in meetings and so forth, and taking those meetings and then kind of having to be a lot of places a lot of time, and a lot of discussions take perhaps more time than they should. Anyway,
Right.
what was the factor that led? Well, what was it like? What got accomplished? What didn't get accomplished? Did you act as any kind of buffer or conduit for your own thoughts? Did you find any of your concepts enacted, or things that of which you were inimical, not enacted?
Yes and yes. So it's a very different experience being a chief executive and being a member of a board, whether it's a public board like the school committee or a corporate board or whatever. And in my career, I've done both. I've been chief executive, but I've also been on boards, on nonprofit and corporate boards. So I'm used to both. And I didn't have any misconception about what the role would be on the school committee. Whereas I say, unless you have 5 votes, you don't move the issue, right? So there have been issues where I've been both outvoted and where I've been in the majority. And what you try to do is to be respectfully persuasive with the other members of the committee. And sometimes you win and sometimes you don't. So let me give you an example. The school committee has a number of functions by statute. For example, we approve the budget. We are engaged in collective bargaining with the teachers' unions and the other unions. We hire and evaluate, fire, or retain the superintendent. Those are 3 of the main functions of the school committee. But another function of the school committee, and it's part of evaluating the superintendent, is to establish broad objectives for the Newton Public Schools as a whole for the coming year. Now, shortly after we arrived, some objectives broad objectives were set forth by the administration. And several of us on the school committee didn't feel they were concrete enough, weren't quantitative enough. They were aspirational in nature. And while it's good to have some qualitative aspirational objectives, our view, having campaigned during the previous year, was that the public wanted more of a report card, wanted to know whether the school department was actually succeeding or not in certain areas. And so we pursued that, and we failed on that. There was a vote in which 3 of us, I think, voted for it to make it more quantitative and more precise, but the majority did not want to do that. Now, as we get to our discussion of the override in a little while, I think that in part contributed to some people in the community not having sufficient confidence in the school department. And I'm not talking about their teachers. This is like Congress. You know, we all like our congressmen. We don't like Congress. We all like our teachers because they're taking care of our kids, and they're very devoted, and they do a great job. But what I was hearing during the campaign and afterwards is that people in the community did not have confidence in the administration of the Newton Public Schools or in the school committee itself in terms of setting forth concrete, measurable objectives that would serve as a report card to the community, and where if you weren't quite meeting the objectives, you would be honest about it, and you'd say, well, we're trying hard to do X, Y, and Z. We didn't quite get there, and not for the sake of gotcha, but for the sake of consistent quality improvement, which is what a lot of corporations are good at. You admit where you're not good, and you try to get better. So we lost that vote. And to me, that was a very significant vote to lose that had ramifications well beyond that particular meeting.
So that's a fascinating point. You know, they say elections have consequences, but consequences have elections.
Correct. Well, and I think that's what we've seen in the city. You know, during the override vote, you saw a very interesting result. You saw that the 2 debt exclusion override questions to rebuild Franklin School and Countryside School, which are old and decrepit and need to be rebuilt. No question about that. Passed. But the general override, which was put more in terms of we need money to help the operating deficit of the school and some other things, did not. And so it wasn't, you can't look at that override vote and say that the public was against the schools. You just can't. But what you can say is, looking at that override vote, was that people did not have sufficient confidence in how that incremental money would be spent to vote yes on it. Now, I have to tell you, I think that's a shame in the following way, that if the public schools create the fabric of the community, in my view, whether you have kids in school or whether you don't. They're very important to the fabric of the community. And if the community loses faith in that institution of the public schools, and therefore doesn't give the school department sufficient funding to continue to excel into the future, eventually that turns around and bites you. You get into a downward spiral. We can talk about efficiency and so on in a second. I have a feeling we will. But you get into a downward spiral where then some people, the ones who can afford it, start to go to private school instead of public school. And the number of people who are going to private school right now is very high compared to the past. And every time a child goes to private school, there's a pretty good chance that both parents or guardians or who's ever in charge of those kids are less likely to vote for a tax increase because they're spending $40,000 post-tax dollars a year on tuition.
They've already self-imposed a tax increase.
That's right.
By voting with their wallet, their feet, their kid.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but so in my view, it's not good for the community when the public as a whole has doubts about the efficacy of the school system, about the way in which it's being managed and the decisions that are being made. So our goal, my goal, and that of 2 or 3 of my colleagues on the school committee, newly elected members, was to try to enhance the credibility of what we were doing so that the public confidence would also be enhanced.
Right. So taking it to try to make it non-political, if you were either Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Antonin Scalia / Kennedy or whatever, ex-justices, some deceased, you would want to stick it out on the court and wait for the majority to arrive. So Ruth Bader was not always in the majority,
right.
and sometimes she was, and sometimes she was not. She stuck it through, thick and thin times, good and bad, and maybe too long, in her case. But 2 years would have been too short, and so to get into the court, I think it's hard. I think the real speed bump is to get in.
Yeah.
And once you're incumbent, to make my made-up word, it's harder to become an outcumbent. And there's some, people have name recognition. They vote for the things they vote for, and they vote for them again because they voted for them. Anyway,
Right.
So, for you to have left that kind of mini sinecure, is disappointing for those of us who see you as one of the more reasonable voices on the school committee.
I should explain why. And remember, I told you during COVID, I didn't have much business. And I had the time to run and to serve on the school committee. With the end of the pandemic, my business life has picked up, and I do international consulting.
Oh, good for you.
And now I'm expected to be there, to be in Australia, to be in South America, to be in the UK, and to be in Israel. And what I found over the last year is you can't do the school committee job well remotely.
Fair enough. And you don't have a clone?
I wouldn't even presume to designate a clone. I think every person who runs has to do it on their own. I would encourage anybody to run because I think it's a good thing to have competition for these positions. As a general matter, to your point, if I had run again, the chance of anyone running against me was pretty small. Mm-hmm. Maybe for 3 or 4 terms altogether. And it's a shame, I think, that most incumbents do not have challengers, because I think the public debate every 2 years is a good thing. But right now, so my seat will be open, Kathy Shields in Ward 7's seat will be open, and I would hope that people would step up and try to run.
What's the actual physical time commitment?
It's a lot more than I thought. I used to joke, I'm not going to run for city council because it takes too much time. Mm-hmm. What I discovered is that the school committee takes a lot of time. Mm-hmm. There's the regular meetings twice a month. That's no big deal. Prepping for them takes several hours, but then there are additional things. So for example, I'm on the negotiating committee that's negotiating the next contract with the Newton Teachers Association. We have planning meetings, we have collective bargaining sessions. Those take hours and hours. We're also expected to be out there in the community. For example, I'm the liaison with the Special Education Parent Advisory Committee. And they have a regular meeting, but we also have other events to go to. So I think at a minimum, you're looking at 10 hours a week, sometimes more, depending on what positions you have on the school committee. And for someone who's trying to earn a living or raise children, that's hard because many of those meetings are at night. Our meetings, for example, start at 6:30 and they go till 10 o'clock.
And you can't have a cutout for Zoom?
You can. You can. Oh, you mean a cutout?
Yeah, cardboard.
No,
cardboard cutout.
That's frowned upon. Good idea, though. Maybe in the next few months I'll use that.
Well, AI is just taking leaps and bounds.
Maybe I'll have ChatGPT make my remarks for me also.
Yes. Well, that is not impossible, just for the record. But we're not. How do we prove it? We can't.
We can't. By the way, there's an interesting curriculum issue, pedagogical issue, which is teachers are being encouraged to use ChatGPT to design their exams. Mm-hmm. What about students? Should they be encouraged to use ChatGPT to answer the exams? It's
another topic.
Someday.
I literally have an article on this, and people could go reference. It's called ChatCCP, the chatbot with flair, and it's printed in a blog called Dead Man Talking. So I spent a fair amount of time thinking about this. I personally see it like a microwave oven. Some people like them, some people don't like them. I have friends who totally abjure microwave ovens because they see it as a, an affront to the cooking process. But I think it's a very good sous chef want to get something thawed,
Yeah.
or as my wife used to say, unthawed, totally different thing. She would ask me to unthaw something and I'd put it back in the freezer. She'd be like, I told you to unthaw. Anyway, totally separate topic. So anyway, so I commend people to go look at that. But it's an interesting thing. Like I was writing a contract for a writer. He's going to be working on a screenplay idea of mine, but he's writing the treatment up. And so, like, what do I put in a contract like that? So I said, well, make believe I'm a book publisher. What would you put in? Blah, blah, blah. I gave the basic parameters, price, and the thing came out with a reasonable lawyer contract. And I read it over, and I took out parts, added parts, whatever. But it's very reasonable framework for what that thing is. And so they're very, very useful tools. And we use Google Translate. You go traveling, you go to Japan. I mean, I don't speak Japanese. I'm not going to learn it fast enough, aside from a few words, maybe thank you. And you can have conversations. So I think it's a tool like a microwave, like Google Translate. And if it takes over for your entire brain, you only follow it, then then you're not really worth your salt, as it were.
No, and there are already people who are talking about how to use that kind of technology in an appropriate way, pedagogically.
Yeah.
So, for example, one article I read, I think it was in Tech Review, suggested that it's okay for the student to do the first draft using ChatGPT, but then should document to the teacher what edits they make, and to basically present a history of their edits and what they've learned along the way. So there's a lot.
Yeah,
anyway.
I mean, a lot of people are not going to become great writers anyway, and they've already, we've already. I went to high school, I think probably similar, a little after me, maybe similar era, and in the Jurassic period somewhere, or Paleozoic, somewhere back there. And we had those, what do they call those notes? The Cliff Notes.
Cliff Notes, right.
And so people were reading that instead of reading Great Expectations. They had very few expectations. They had lesser expectations. So reading Great Expectations, so they expected to read the one that was already.
But here, I mean, if you think about what are we trying to do in the school's big picture, this goes back to Horace Mann. First public school was in Massachusetts. Why? Because Horace Mann saw a bunch of immigrants coming to America.
Exactly right.
And he was watching them and say, well, how do we help these folks become good citizens? And
Yes.
that was the beginning of public education in America. So what is it that we want in good citizens? Well, probably the most important thing we want is critical thinking ability, right? To look at an issue and to, whether passionately or dispassionately, look at the issue, look at what people have said about it or are saying about it, what the history books say about it, what the current literature says about it, and to be able to ask interesting, thoughtful questions and draw your own conclusions, so that when it's time to vote, you know how to think through things.
So that's going to be a topic for maybe further discussion, whether that's actually occurring. Because the word critical is a critical word in this critical process of critical thinking, and it's been turned around to be CRT, critical race theory, and almost anything good can be flipped on its head. And so it's kind of ironic. Horace Mann, as you say, I think he's from Lincoln or Sudbury, one of those places a little west of here. His concept was to make an annealing process, to alloy and ally people together to form a stronger whole. And so I gather when you mix the metals together, they make something that's a little bit. Steel is better than iron, rust, steel, make stainless steel. And with the schools, that was the concept. I think I came at the tail end of that in the 1960s going through public school, where we were, kind of taught to be part of something bigger. And I think there's a different process going on now where people are kind of having this division. And I think some of the failures of the school, I'm going to give you the last word in a second, we have only a few more minutes, but some of the failures of the school because of this divisive or divisive process where people are being pitted against each other. And we saw it during Zoom time, during COVID time. I think a lot of parents saw, not just here, but in other places around the country, that some of the teaching process was separating kids and kind of naming them according to critical race theory, things they couldn't change, their race, their background, their ethnicity, and giving kind of an intersectional scorecard of where you stood on this.
Well, it would take a lot of time to go through everything you've just said, but what I will say is that both during the campaign and when we were doing our search for superintendent, we did a very extensive survey of the community and also focus groups. And in both of those instances, what we heard from parents is that they were not pleased with the overall direction of the Newton schools. Now that's a general statement, the overall direction, what does it mean? What people were telling me is they felt that the schools had lost their way in terms of the pursuit of academic rigor and excellence, which is why they felt they were coming here. And there are a lot of different ways to teach about social justice and tolerance and the like. And I don't think we have time to get into that right here. But when that many people say that they feel something is missing from the mix between excellence and equity in the schools, I think the school committee and the mayor should listen,
Yep.
make a judgment. We have a new superintendent who's going to have to be making those judgments in the future, and I'm a very good person, Anna Nolan, and I'll be very curious to see how she handles that issue.
Well, thank you. So we're hitting in the home stretch, and I'd like to, I mean, we've covered some of these major things. I think it's important to think back both to Horace Mann and to Martin Luther King, and some of the rationales and reasons they had for their thoughts. You know, Martin Luther King famously wanted people to be judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And Horace Mann wanted people to come together, you know, get beyond their ethnicity and form kind of a cohesive part of a country and be working citizens.
But I guess what I'm saying, Randy, is how to do that is not at all simple. And it's both a matter of philosophy of the schools, but it's also a matter of pedagogical approaches in the classroom.
Right.
And that's why I'm saying we could spend a lot of time on that issue.
Absolutely. And so we're going to have to end in just a few seconds, but since I get the last word, I want to thank you very much for coming. And I also want to point out that if Beth Israel or Apple or Google, whatever, lost 14% of their user base, heads would roll. And if they didn't manage to get them back, then those, you know, they would reduce their workforce. They would make changes at the top and so forth. There's a clear message to the schools that when they lost 14% of people who pay nothing additional to be in those schools, they should learn to treat those people better and so forth. So it's not always a given. Thank you so much for listening to us today, and hopefully you'll share this message with your friends and come back soon. Thank you so much.